So, one of the things I wanted to question you on was some of the other voices that you were able to pull in for this volume 2, some of the people who were guests, and if there were any interviews or just varied perspectives of people you were able to include.
Oh, well, I have 3 forwards for the book. One of them is Yada Ben Israel, who is the host of the Men's Morning Show and the author of the upcoming book, The Men's Manifesto. He and I actually co-host. I'm one of the co-hosts of the Men's Morning Show as well. And he wrote the forward for Volume 1. I'm transferring that to Volume 2 as well. Then Brother Che Nazareth, who I've also mentioned in the beginning of this discussion. And then I have Baba Kalindi Ayi, who is a 30-plus year veteran in polygyny. I mean, he's been married for, all that time to multiple women. And he has already told me he'd be glad to write one of the forwards for my book. And I'm trying to get Dr. Patricia Dixon Spear, who wrote One for Our Sisters, One for Ourselves, to write the introduction. And I sat and spoke with her about it. Of course, her book was the first that I read on polygyny. That was strictly about polygyny itself back in 2004 in her first edition. I've got those, all 4 of those people were great because they all influenced me in some way, shape, or form to continue in the work. And I've also got some reviews by people, and of course, I'm going to have you write one of the reviews. You're very familiar with polygyny, and you've written books on relationships. And
yes.
Yeah, man. I'm honored to be in that number myself. I still feel like I'm a babe in it, and I've done a lot of research, but it pales in comparison to a lot of others. And I'm new to that type of marriage.
I've never seen it practiced in a way that I totally agree with. And I'm sure even for people who may have 10, 15 years and they may feel the same way, it's a lot of trial and error, because even if you have a certain cultural acclimation or origin, you're bringing in 3 or 4 or 2 other women, they may not have come up in that same village with you. So it may take 5 or 6 years just to acclimate your cultures and mores and norms with one person before you can even address the higher sciences of a polygynous relationship. The key is really, I think we're all going to be babies in this for a couple of decades to come. It's the first group like yourself who are finally coming out of the shadows with some boldness and differentiating between the various forms of polygamy and making it clear that polygyny is something different, and more specifically, polygyny from an indigenous perspective and polygyny from an indigenous perspective re-engineered for today is something completely different than the common conception of polygamy. And it's going to take some time, maybe another 20, 30 years, 40 years before we can no longer say that we're babes in this tradition and in this way.
I think we'll be learning, man, for until we're elders. There's so many intricacies, and there's so many changes that can occur in a polygynous family that you're always going to be shifting and moving and learning. My consort brought up something to me along these lines, a couple of days ago. She said, Hondo, we really have to consider that no matter how many wives that you marry, you may end up losing some of the wives along the way because they may decide to leave. For whatever reason, or we may have to, kick them out of families. She said, what if I get tired one day and I want to leave? And, she looked me right in the eyes. And it was one of those intimate moments where you're with your consort and you can really feel them, what they're saying. You hear them, but you really feel them.
Right.
And it was one of those moments. And she was looking me right in the eyes, and I said, you know what, babe, you're right. I was like, you're right. That's real talk. I couldn't say anything against what she was saying. I didn't like the thought of, maybe not having her in my life, but she's a good sister. But she spoke the truth, and it was real. And we have to get to that point. And I started thinking about how a family could shift and how you would be learning forever. You would never stop learning.
Right. I think that's also an important point that she made, because I know you've come across this in your study. You had to, because I know I did. A lot of people you speak to, they may have 2 wives, let's say, and they'll say, yeah, at one point I had 7. At one point I had, 5, and it seems like the numbers are always, yes, that always would kind of tickle me. I'd say, wow, and it would fluctuate. I had 7 and then I went to 3, then I had 11, and now I'm back down to 1. I always would hear that one. I'm down to 1 now, which would always cause me to really kind of pull out the magnifying glass. What's going on here?
I stopped counting how many times I've heard that story. In fact, there's a guy, he's a former celebrity that I know, when he was much younger, he was very much in the limelight. They were, they still playing the songs on the radio, and the brother, of course, is a grown man now, and I met him, and he's been telling me about polygyny, and he said, I used to have some wives, and they were from 2 different continents, and he said, man, he just kind of like had this reflective but kind of sad look on his face and in his voice while he was speaking with me about it. He said, man, you need this, you need that, you gotta have this. He said, man, it's hard, man, it's hard. And to hear the levels of difficulty that vary from man to man, it's interesting. It's very interesting, because I have heard where I've heard men say, well, man, I used to have 5 and now I got 2. And right. I used to have 3, now I got none. Or I'm down to 1 and I used to have 8,
Right.
And I always like, man, I wonder how going through the divorce process is a trip. And I do cover the divorce process in volume 2. I actually have a divorce clause as part of the marriage contract.